Hey, JJ, when's the last time you almost didn't make it to the bathroom?
Like every day of my life. I mean, there's look, I don't have the best system. As people know, I've gone gluten and dairy free, and I felt great since doing that. So things have been better. It's been years since that happened. But yeah, I mean, I feel that I've experienced that before.
Yeah. So yesterday I met up with a friend in Santa Monica for lunch, and my 3-year-old tagged along with us. And on the hour-long drive back, about halfway, I got a real mean case of the Bee Gees. And my son had fallen asleep. So there was only one option, JJ, and that was to get home. I am an adult. I'm not going to S in my P's as an adult. But I will say, as painful as that half hour was, it was still less painful than trying to draft a stackable quarterback at ADP.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I think this might be episode 10 of this series. So we are in the double digits. I'm JJ Zacharyson, joined as always by my co-host Rich Ryan. Rich, I'm glad you were seemingly able to find the restroom.
I got home, I penguin walked like Jalen Waddle, and I made it to the restroom.
Yeah, look, I feel you. I remember it was like our 5th year anniversary. My wife and I, we were dating at the time, so it was our dating anniversary. And we went out to a steakhouse in downtown Cincinnati when I was living in Cincinnati. And we had a valet. And when we left, right when I got in the car, I realized I gotta go. And since we were only about 10 minutes away from home, I hazard flashed. Is that a verb? I hazard flashed the entire way home, blew some red lights, and I made it. I made it back, but it was quite the adventure.
The red lights were honestly the hardest part because the driving, I was able to do some breathing and like just movement. But when there's that stillness and you're just battling with your mind at that point. Those are really the only challenges.
I don't know how people live in like LA and stuff because, and I'm sure you've experienced plenty of this type of traffic and whatnot, but like I honestly have like some sort of sensation and feeling of complete dread and wanting to just do anything to get out of the situation. Just a lot of anxiety when I'm stuck in like construction or something and I'm just literally sitting there for like 20 minutes and not moving at all. I don't know how people deal with that on a daily basis in LA. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's why God invented podcasts. That's really
true.
Gotten us through so many troubling times.
Someone listening to this right now might be stuck in LA traffic, right. And they're like, yeah, I feel you. I totally feel you. This sucks. But yeah, like LA, you go like 5 miles over a half an hour. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, after lunch, I dropped my buddy off at LAX, and it was 35 minutes to go 8 miles from Santa Monica to LAX.
Yeah, I can't do that. I just can't do that. And I'm the person who, you know, because I live in the suburbs in Charlotte, but I'm the person, even if there's some traffic, and we get, you know, it's like suburban traffic, a populated suburb, and it's not like Charlotte's small, but like, you know, I will go out of my way to go back roads to just be able to drive and not have to sit in traffic, even if it means that I'm a minute or two later. I just want to move the car around. It's like when I go to the beach, I can't just sit down on the beach all day. I gotta like get up and move around and go for walks and just do something. I can't just sit still. I might have a problem. I might. Anyway, let's talk best ball. No one cares about these gripes. How has your week been going? The
quarterback thing is real. Like that was a joke for the cold open, but
it is.
I seriously made my worst selection of the entire summer. Post tilting, I started a Waddle, Tyreek, Mostert stack and was looking to grab Tua, and someone who had just selected and unstacked, I believe it was Joe Burrow, took Tua a full round above ADP in front of me, completely unstacked, which sent me into dizzying tilt.
Yeah.
So later on, I had this great idea that I was going to just grab a sneaky buck stack Cade Otton and Baker Mayfield were right there, and I was at pick 3, and it was on the comeback. So with my first pick, I saw that Otton was higher in the queue, so I was like, okay, let me just grab him first. But I didn't. This is completely my fault. I didn't look at the board because the person drafting after me had both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So I grabbed Cade Otton, and immediately Baker Mayfield was gone, and I went into dizzying, seething tilt at myself, not at anybody else but myself.
That's the thing with those later round stacks is that you really, obviously like ADP is going to dictate that to some degree. Like whoever has the higher ADP, you're probably going to want to take first as like a default, right? Like I don't know who, I think Baker probably has the higher ADP between him and Otton right now, but regardless, let's just say Baker's ahead of Otton. You would probably by default say, I'm going to go with Baker. But let's say you're in the 10 spot, and in the 11 and 12 spot, they already have pretty good quarterback options and they don't have good tight ends. Those are the scenarios where you just go with Otton instead. It's sort of to some degree like what I've talked about with Lamar Jackson, where you just get Mark Andrews if you're in the front half of the draft, you get Mark Andrews first because people are going to have the hope of getting Mark Andrews if they select Lamar Jackson, right? But if you get Mark Andrews, you wipe out that hope of them getting that stack, so then they don't go after Lamar Jackson. It's similar to this, where if you're able to get like a Cade Otton, and maybe they were even thinking about doing that with like a late stack, then you're forcing them to get like an unstacked Baker Mayfield. In this case, a little bit different because they had Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, but you're forcing them to get an unstacked Baker Mayfield, and that's not optimal, so they might not go that route. But yeah, man, I mean, look, one of my biggest focuses, probably my only focus this week, has been the quarterback position. And I asked this to our guests today, which you guys will listen to in a second, Eric Beimfor. I have noticed that teams are going after quarterbacks at just an unreasonable rate. And the way that they're approaching the quarterback position hasn't been super rational. And I say that not as if like I have the answers. I say that objectively, people are doing things that just don't make any sense, right? Like earlier today, I drafted Jaden Reed and Christian Watson, and I'm waiting for Jordan Love. I did push it by a round, and he would have been drafted, 4 spots past ADP had I gotten him where I wanted. But two places before me, Jordan Love gets drafted to a team without any Vikings, without any Packers, so he doesn't have the Week 17 correlation, and with Jalen Hurts. It's those kinds of situations. And I of course we've experienced the Tua stuff like you talked about. I've experienced, and I started off this series with a Kirk Cousins tilt. It happened, I ended up kind of making up for it. I didn't mind my team at the end of the day. And we've talked about this over and over and over again, but I think over the next month, man, we're going to see this be a lot more prevalent. We're going to see it everywhere. Within these drafts, and that's a little bit scary. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is get ahead of it a little bit and not be as afraid to reach at quarterback by a little bit instead of extracting some of that value, especially if it's like a later round guy, like a Kirk Cousins or something. Like the difference between a 12th to 14th round pick is not going to be super, super significant. So I'm okay with reaching by about a round to get a guy to make sure that I complete the stack.
Yeah, so of quarterbacks that are currently on teams, because for some reason both Taulia Tagovailoa and Tom Brady have been drafted at some point during this process. So of quarterbacks that are currently on teams, 24 have at least a neutral or even a positive ADP bump week over week right now. 24 quarterbacks on teams. So this is definitely something that's happening. And then just some Madden things, like a guy who had Jamar Chase taking naked Dak instead of Burrow, when Burrow's like after ADP. So yeah, it's just, you got one, don't tilt, don't go into dizzying, seething tilt like I did. Try to remain calm. And then, you just got to be as fluid as possible, because there's going to be way more randomness. The closer we get to the season starting, you're just going to see way more randomness in the drafts that you're in.
Yeah. Talked a lot about that in the interview. So hopefully people will get some game theory and some strategy takeaways from that discussion for sure.
All right, let's talk players. And again, we've brought them up several times, and I'll say it again. This was the first reel I made in the off season. A very fun back out of Denver. It's Jaleel McLaughlin. That is a name. Yeah. I grew up with a kid named Lachlan. was his last name. So this is just a name I will butcher in perpetuity. Apologies.
Yeah, I feel like naming the right pronunciations is important to me, as I've said before on the show. Like Kamani Vidal I bookmarked a video of him saying his name in my browser, and so he says Vidal like almost like an ELL instead of an AL. So a lot of people are saying Vidal and stuff like that. It's actually Kamani Vidal, and so McLaughlin has like that F sound with the GH. But yeah, look. I've talked about Jaleel McLaughlin since the beginning of the offseason. He was a dynasty buy for me. You know, you look at his metrics last year on a per rush basis. Now, this isn't a total apples to apples comparison, but on a per rush basis, he was better than Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine across the board, just everywhere. And then the statistic that I keep bringing up is that Sean Payton, since 2011, his teams have owned 8 of the top 20. It's actually top 17. 8 of the top 17 team running back target share seasons, which is absolutely bonkers considering he didn't even coach every single year during that time frame. And so, last year they led the NFL and running back target share. You look at their situation right now, they don't have locked in pass catchers. We don't even know who the starting tight end is right now because Greg Dulcich can't stay healthy. Obviously Cortland Sutton's there, but then you have a question mark with Marvin Mims, a question mark with Troy Franklin, who I liked as a prospect, but we just don't know. And now there's this talk about Javonte Williams, maybe getting cut between him and Samaje Perine. I'm of the belief that Javonte Williams is going to be on that team. And I said on my podcast yesterday that if Javonte Williams gets the exact same workload that he saw last year, he's actually not a bad pick at ADP. Like he averaged, in terms of expected points per game last year, this is PPR, but he averaged, in that like 13 to 14 range, which is like, that's expected points per game. He played a little bit below that expectation, but that's like low end, that's like RB2 numbers. If he were to see that kind of workload again this year, and maybe he could see more too, because there hypothetically might be, they might just want to give him more after that knee injury. But Jaleel McLaughlin, I think, is just safe. Like he's just a safe pick because you don't have the question marks of him getting cut. He was really, really good last year. I think he's going to be involved this year. Sean Payton's already saying positive things about him. He's a good pass catcher. He can play a pass catching role. So I think that given he's got some explosiveness, I don't think he's going to be a bell cow, but I think in best ball, you don't necessarily need that for him to pay off. Like he can have a big play and all of a sudden a 60-yard touchdown, he's usable that given week. So the fact that he's going to get work, again, it just goes back to I love that pocket of players. I love those rookie running backs in that pocket. I love Jaleel McLaughlin. And I've just noticed that this week I've gotten a lot of Jaleel as like a sort of safety blanket, if I go more hero RB or zero RB.
Yeah, with this negative news tug of war between Samaje and Javonte, it's a good spot to be in where no news is going to be good news for Jaleel. They want him to be on this roster and be a part of that running back group. You've got another running back that you're focusing on out west, but in the other conference. This time it's rookie Blake Corum. You've been clicking him a lot, JJ.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised by this because when the draft happened and when I was looking at my dynasty rankings, when I first released them, I was too low on Corum. I switched it up after thinking about the situation a little bit more. Corum is higher than he was like right after the draft because I obviously give people rankings right after the draft is over. And I'm trying to give you the most accurate that I can possibly give, but I think about this stuff. I see reports, I look at data, and things will change. It's just naturally how things go. So I was too low on Corum after the draft. I didn't mind him as a prospect. Thought he was very, very solid as a prospect. That didn't change. The thing that worried me was obviously Kyren Williams being there. And I do think Sean McVay and company love them some Kyren Williams. I do think that they do. But if you look at the draft guide, Kyren Williams right now is a fade for me or an avoid at ADP. I do have some fear because a lot of the market trends that we don't want out of RB1s, he has, which is he has a lower prospect score, which does get signal with RB1s. He also has a running back teammate getting drafted in the top 48 at the position in Blake Corum, which tells you that player, this is why this market trend matters, because that other player is probably going to get some work in that backfield, which means there's less work for Kyren Williams. And then you look at the team's actions. They can say what they want, but if you look at their actions, they went out and they spent a day 2 pick to get Corum, who of all the running backs in this class matches Kyren Williams the most as a prospect, as a player. Smaller back, can do it all, really solid as whether it be in between the tackles or as a receiver. And so my fear with Kyren is that he's not going to see quite the workload that some are projecting him to see. And then as a result, I'm just kind of flipping that around and saying, okay, I don't think Corum is as viable, to be fair, in a managed season-long league. Like, it's similar to like a Zach Charbonnet, let's say. Like, I don't mind going Charbs. I think the difference between Corum and a Charbonnet is that I actually think Charbonnet has a better chance to just be the guy that coaching staff wants to use. Do I think that's probable? No, but I think it's more possible than Blake Corum just naturally overtaking that backfield and being more of like the 60 out of the 100 in the 60-40 split as opposed to the 40, if that makes sense, right? So like, I do think that like a player like a Charbonnet might be a little bit more attractive in a managed season-long league because he could just do that. But to me, Corum, you're not going to have to predict when those big performances might come as a backup. But then on top of that, he has the injury upside, right? So I think Corum is being drafted sort of close to his projection, whereas Zach Charbonnet is being drafted at his projection. So Charbonnet, I've just gotten a lot more of. But over the last couple of weeks, I've just found myself going above ADP and getting Corum in certain builds. And I wanted to call that out because, I'm trying to be transparent about how I'm drafting these teams.
It's so funny that you call out this type of intra-squad competition as being a negative, and we know that because volume is so important at the running back position, whereas I feel like the entire best ball space has been quarreling about Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua at a position where, and you've studied this before, two guys can eat and return value in the same offense. So people are quarreling about two guys that are probably likely to meet ADP.
Yeah, they could. Right.
And both be good players. Whereas this other position, which is super valuable, running back, where we're all chasing upside at, there's this like very obvious thing that we can attack that people are not looking at.
And look, with Kyren Williams, I get the upside. Of course I get the upside. Look at his points per game last year. Like if they end up giving him the rock and letting him be the bell cow he was last year, I just don't think it's going to happen because everything points to them trying to relieve that a little bit after he got hurt last year. Like he was not, if he went through last season fully healthy and everything was butterflies and rainbows and they didn't spend, a pick on Blake Corum, even if they did spend a pick on Blake Corum, I might not be, as bearish on Kyren, but I am because all of their actions sort of point to them. I think Kyren can be fine and he still comes out as like a low end RB1 in my projections and such, but I just don't know if, he's worthy of like automatic. And I said this, do you remember this like a month and a half ago? I said that I was drafting Derrick Henry over Kyren Williams. That was one of my, and like, I just don't see the reason why Kyren needs to go ahead of Derrick Henry. I don't see the reason why. I've seen Kyren go ahead of Devon Achane in some drafts. And I don't see the need or reason for that. And I even think that you can make the argument that Isaiah Pacheco should go ahead of Kyren Williams, right? It's not like Pacheco has less competition. We don't know for sure that Kyren's going to have a dramatically larger target share than Isaiah Pacheco will. I think the only difference between a Kyren and a Pacheco is that there might be more scoring opportunities for Kyren, maybe only because the Chiefs are so pass heavy at the goal line. But I'm having a hard time understanding why the market seems to not be factoring in Blake Corum enough. They're factoring it in some way, because if they weren't, he would be like a 1-2 turn guy, which he was before the NFL draft happened, right? Where he was the bell cow. But with Corum there, I'm a little bit worried about what that ceiling might look like.
The last player, we know historically that tight ends tend to succeed when they're attached to very good quarterbacks. So, JJ, what if I told you that there's potentially a top 5 quarterback who may or may not have cosplayed as Eminem here on the first day of training camp, who has a tight end that's being drafted in the 200s?
Yeah. I'm gonna preface this and say that our guest today has a slightly different take than me on this, but I think his take is not wrong because we're talking about 18th round picks, right? And I think that's what's key here. When you're looking at an 18th rounder, to me, you can take any news item and run with it because you're not investing that. Like, what if that news item ends up being correct, like a Kyren Williams being used more last year, like by what Jordan Rodriguez had reported, or all of the hype that Puka Nacua was getting last year? If you just ignored those things, you had 0 of those players more than likely. I do think that we have to take some reporting and, be at least, and use it to our advantage at least a little bit, or implement it, especially with these late round picks where we don't know what the talent profile might look like. We don't know what the fit in the offense might look like. So lean into the variability and lean into these items that we see, because it's not like the market is necessarily reacting on a guy like Mike Gesicki, who we're calling out here, right? He's still an 18th round pick. Like, he's still going at the end of drafts. And there's a report out there saying that he could actually be the biggest winner of Tyler Boyd not being in the slot in that Cincinnati offense. And maybe he plays a big slot role, which that's what Mike Gesicki has done throughout his career. You know, I talked about this before on the show with Jonnu Smith, where a lot of people were like, well, if Mike Gesicki couldn't be a relevant tight end with Mike McDaniel, then Jonnu Smith can't be. Well, Mike Gesicki didn't play a traditional tight end role when he was in Miami because he's not a traditional tight end. He's a big slot. Like, that's what Gesicki is. He just has that tight end tag, and we can use that to our advantage a little bit, because we can ask ourselves, what if they do use him in that role, in that slot type role, in that hybrid role? All of a sudden he could be a big red zone threat with a team that should throw the ball a lot, should score a lot of touchdowns. I don't think that the talent of Mike Gesicki is like through the roof good, but I'm willing to throw an 18th round dart. You know, if I get an elite tight end early, or if I'm in a 3 tight end build, especially if I get Joe Burrow, I'm fine with going that direction. But this is a bit of a teaser as well for the guest, because he has a really good take that I don't even disagree with, that relates to the same position on this same team that I think people are going to like.
Let's get into the take then. You got me sitting on pins and needles over here.
Yeah, let's do it. I talked to Eric Beimfohr. He's a high volume best ball player who runs things over at spikeweek.com. We talked about how his strategy is going to change, if it's going to change, with some more casual players entering the picture, which again, I mentioned in his interview, and I'll mention it again right now. That's not a derogatory thing if you're a casual player. I'm literally saying that just to sort of tell you that there's going to be more inexperienced players coming in, because you guys aren't degenerates who have been drafting since May. That's really what it comes down to. I'm the sicko. You're not the sicko. But more casual players are entering the mix. We had a discussion about exposure, which I feel like we haven't talked about enough sort of on this show. Despite this being episode 10 of this series, talked about late round targets, whether that's tight ends or just regular players at running back and wide receiver, and more. It was a really, really great discussion. So without further ado, here's my interview with Eric. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played over at Underdog yet, now's the perfect time. There are tons of different best ball leagues that you can join, and there's definitely a league out there that fits what you're looking for. And you can use all the things that I've talked about with guests on Becoming a Best Ball Bro to crush those drafts. But like I said, now's the right time to join up. Because if you go and you sign up and use promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a nice deposit offer, but you also get a free late round draft guide. That's a $25 guide emailed to your inbox after signing up for absolutely free. So head to UnderdogFantasy.com, sign up using promo code LATEROUND, and make a deposit. I can confirm it's a really, really fun platform to play on. Now back to the show. All right, Eric, we're going to see a change in demographic over the next month over on Underdog, where, you know, I don't want to like speak down to people who are like more casual with this stuff. And I feel like when you call people casuals, it's like a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. Actually, they're much healthier than we are when it comes to best ball and drafting these teams. But we are going to see sort of a change in demographic. And my question to you is, what are you going to change as sort of less experienced drafters enter the fold? Is your strategy going to change at all?
Yeah, so it's funny because on one hand, we're getting, from now until the season, more and more, like you said, casual. Well, we would consider like a little weaker competition, and which is great. We want to be swimming in the waters where, there's more fish as opposed to more sharks. But we're also gaining more information during this exact time as well. So it's this balancing act where we want to be that's part of the advantage that we have as, kind of players that are taking it more serious and drafting over the course of the whole summer, is being able to react to the information more effectively. But our opponents may be weaker and they're getting the same information, and kind of ADP is guiding them into theoretically the right decision. So it's a pretty fun balancing act where I'm not like changing a ton about what I'm doing, but I'm being very ready to pounce on situations when I think we've learned something, that the market has changed, some situation has changed from what our expectation was. Obviously, last year there was a couple that mostly happened to be on the Rams, apparently. So be on the lookout for the Rams, I guess, this summer. But we found out about the Kyren Williams and Cam Akers situation, and we found out that Puka Nacua was probably just pretty good and starting from day one for the Rams, not just yet, but pretty soon, late July, August, definitely into September. We learned that, and so being ready to pounce on. Probably not a Kyren Williams Puka thing this year, but we're going to learn things about backup running backs and wide receiver threes and starting quarterbacks in some of these situations, and just being ready to kind of pounce once we get it is kind of the perk of drafting now. And I think some of our opponents coming in may not be as ready to pounce and understand what the right prices are and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing too, I think that when you have sort of like a baseline of a player's ADP journey throughout the summer, it seems like you might have an advantage, right? Where it's like, oh, I knew that this player was, the wide receiver was a round 8 pick and he's moved to round 6, and why has that happened? And I just have that information and that knowledge, and that can help me, be reactive to sort of what's going on. But also, let me follow up with this actually. Do you think that you have a bigger advantage as a seasoned vet, as someone who's playing a lot, against more casual gamers, because you're better at roster construction and game theory, or do you attribute it more to the newsy stuff that you're talking about, where you're looking at that stuff more, you're analyzing that stuff deeper than others might be analyzing? Like, is there, or is it just both?
I think, just like about everything, it's not really like necessarily binary. Yeah. I think you have to have, best ball is funny in that it's not any one, like you could probably say from a DFS perspective, I show up and like, I'm just better at the game theory element, or my projections are better, which is a little tougher nowadays. Season long managed leagues, like I just know the right kinds of players to pick. I know how to play the waivers better, all that kind of stuff. In best ball, I think you kind of have to have this toolkit of all these different things, and we kind of call them levers, right? I want to be able to pull the roster construction lever, but I do want to be able to pull like the game theory lever. We do a lot of that work. I think that's probably where I and we in our little Spike Week community excel, is in some of the game theory style stuff. And game theory from a like best ball perspective is kind of awkward and goofy, but super duper basic level things. There are things about the way people draft that are just so predictable. Like ADP, you slap a list, of 1 to 250 in front of somebody, they're going to stick to that, to that list, right? And there's not a lot of reason why some players get drafted together a lot more frequently than other players. Quarterbacks and their teammates for sure, but you'll get a guy, who goes in a similar like wide receiver tier, and he's drafted 2% of the time with another first round pick and 20% of the time with another first round pick. And so some of those little elements are some of the biggest edges, I think, in terms of like, you're not making a worse team. You're just saying this guy's the same as this guy, and I'm going to take the lower owned combination of players. But then you have to be able to react to news. Like I said, last year, if you were able to, everybody started to see the Kyren and Puka and, some of these guys, like it was public. It's all public information, right? We all have access to it. But being able to weed through and parse what is the stuff that is notable and what is just Xavier Worthy caught a 60-yard touchdown, during camp type things. It is a skill, and nobody's perfect at it. But if you can really, like I said, parse through those things and act quickly, that's when, like, those are the most powerful. We're going to learn the most powerful things now. So being able to figure those out is definitely another big edge. So I don't know what the biggest one is, but you definitely got to be able to kind of do a lot of it. You can't just stick your head in the sand and pray that your May takes were the right ones, because you probably were drafting Zach Evans last year in May and it was actually Kyren Williams.
Right. Yeah, the Xavier Worthy example is actually a really good one, because I remember, so that touchdown happens a couple days ago or however long ago it was, and then I hop in a draft pretty soon after that, and he went like 45th overall when his ADP is 65th overall, right? And it's like, you should react, or you can react, not necessarily to that kind of item, but let's say there's a news item that is reactionary worthy, right? No pun intended. And and you are able to then, draft it. You only have to draft a guy a little bit above ADP. Like, you don't need to reach for a guy by 2 rounds, that's 2 rounds of like pretty serious equity. Like we're talking 4th round versus 6th round, which is not irrelevant. You know, it's not like you're talking 15th round to 17th round. And so I do think that that's a piece where like we got to at least watch out for seemingly. I mean, I haven't been in the best ball streets at this volume, this time of year yet. You know, I've always played, throughout the summer and stuff like that, but not to the degree in which I'm playing this year, which is why this podcast even exists in the first place. But what I've at least seen is that every draft seems to have, a drafter that's willing to do something like that. But to me, like, let's just use the Xavier Worthy example really quick. Like, am I wrong to think that there's no need to be that reactionary for any news item? It's just a matter of like, okay, take a guy like 5 spots ahead of ADP. If there's something that you feel like is worthy enough, you don't need to reach by 2 rounds of solid capital, in order to get that guy.
100%. And then so it's interesting because the Xavier Worthy thing is clearly just mostly a fun, highlight that we got to see. But I don't think it's crazy to say, oh, that reminded me, or, oh, he is playing with the ones that, we are getting something like somewhat tangible. Hasn't really changed anything, but it can be okay to say, okay, I want to go draft Xavier. Like, it is kind of fun, right? We can have fun with this too. But it's exactly what you said. So he's going in the mid 60s or something on Underdog. Okay, I got the 60th pick. Like, I can take him here. There's really no big difference between those 2 spots, right? But the problem lies is now I get to the late 3rd, and I'm like, I really wanted to take Xavier Worthy in this one. I'm just going to take him because I don't love whoever is available here. That's when you start to run into some of those problems. You also run into that problem the more expensive the player is. The bigger the reach on at the higher the cost is a real issue. Whereas, again, the most notable stuff that happened last year ended up being late round guys. Although don't tell the people who were drafting Calvin Ridley at the end of the 2nd round last year, because it was kind of this Xavier Worthy level hype train all summer from the Jaguars for Calvin Ridley. But if you're thinking about reaching on that Xavier Worthy style, 6th round pick, 5th round pick, I would be really, really cautious about how far we move up for that. It's okay, like you said, a few picks or something, and it doesn't always align. Your pick may not be his exact ADP, right? It's a snake draft, so that's fine. When we get later in the draft is when it does that balancing act can be a little like it's not as tight of a needle to thread, but also it's difficult to understand when we got some of that actionable information on a guy who's going in the 16th round. How high is it acceptable to reach? Because it's much less. We're talking about a 16th round pick is something like $1 player in an auction draft, right? And maybe a 12th round pick is like a $3 player in an auction draft. Moving from the 6th round to the 4th round is a huge difference. Moving late is not a big difference, and so. I'm much more willing to reach later. Again, not to keep mentioning the Rams last year, but they were just the shining example. Once we got that news, those guys' ADP was in the last round. But if you took him in the 15th, if you wanted both of them, you took him in the 15th, it's totally fine. So figuring out where that line is, I think, is an important thing for everybody. But I'm more willing to reach more the later the draft gets.
Yeah, and it's not like the ADP is going to flip overnight to be 2 rounds higher than, it's going to take a little bit of time for that to happen. I do think that, like, going to the Worthy example, if you believe that the market is going to shift based on what we're seeing and you need some or you want some exposure, that's another reason to sort of get them a little bit ahead of ADP and sort of be ahead of that ADP shift. But again, I think the greater point being that, like, number one, later round picks, you can reach a little bit more easily, but also just remember that ADP isn't going to just like change dramatically overnight. Now, talking about game theory a little bit, and again, going back to this demographic change where at least in August, we're going to definitely see people who haven't been like grinding drafts throughout the summer. One of the positions that I think quarterback is fairly efficient, the way that the market's kind of treating it right now. Doesn't seem like there's obvious ways. I talked to Mark Garcia last week a little bit about like how he's attacking the quarterback position, how there are ways to differentiate potentially. But, one of the things that I've noticed, and I just want your thoughts in general, maybe on quarterback, especially with the change in type of player that's going to be drafting. But one of the things that I've noticed over the last like week and a half or so, is that it seems like quarterback and the stackability of quarterbacks is just becoming a little bit more difficult because people are throwing darts at naked lineups. You know, they don't have Kyle Pitts and Drake London. They're getting Kirk Cousins ahead of ADP because why not? You know, and I get that kind of stuff is going to happen. And I've learned over the last 3 months to not tilt that, out to oblivion when that happens to me, because it's very easy to tilt those experiences. But another example is I was in a draft the other day and I was hurting at quarterback. My QB1 was like Aaron Rodgers or something. I wasn't feeling good. So I was going to get 2 quarterbacks late. And I'm like, okay, I could get like a Bryce Young, Bo Nix type situation late because I had pieces to both those lines. I was setting it up for that, right? And lo and behold, in the 17th round, both of those guys go, one of them to a Mahomes Purdy lineup, right? And it's like, they clearly don't need Bo Nix on this team, but they went out and got Bo Nix. Is that something that we should be thinking about, you know, as August hits with different demographic of players? Is there anything else that you want to throw out there about quarterback and how you're attacking it this year?
Yeah. So first, you're no longer becoming a best ball bro. You are a best ball bro. If you're setting up, you were thinking ahead to the setting up your Bryce Young and Bo Nix stacks. That's how you know you've already come full circle. But it's definitely, quarterback is the one spot where, like, if you think about it, again, as casuals start to come in, it's not even just the skill sets of the players or the ideologies of these new players that are coming in. It's also, we're gathering information about the total collective player pool. And who does that hurt in terms of like weeding out options? It's the running backs and the wide receivers, because we start to learn depth charts. We start to learn like, oh no, Jalen Hyatt is running with the 4s, with the last year for the Giants. And it's like, oh, he should go in the last round, not in the 13th round or whatever. And quarterbacks, we don't get that. We know who all the quarterbacks are, sans a couple of situations, and they're pretty much priced where they're going to be priced regardless. So if we're weeding out running backs and wide receivers, it pulls up quarterbacks. It also makes our opponents, who are maybe some of these slightly more, casual players, less comfortable with the running backs and wide receivers and probably even tight ends that go later in the draft. So what does that mean? Well, there's one position of comfort. I can draft a guy who I know is going to play football this year, and he's going to score fantasy points. Even if it's not actually helping my lineup, those people are thinking about it that way. Like, I don't want to have this, I don't want to draft the Rashad Penny or whatever of last year that we're pipe dreaming is going to be a thing and is a 0 all season. So what you did is what I do a ton. I will say I take a ton of the, like, air quotes, elite quarterbacks. We can pick and choose how we define that. Like, I still think the Dak Prescott-ish tier is kind of elite. And then we also have the new rookie class, particularly Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams. I'm into Trevor Lawrence. There's kind of, I would almost call like Trevor Lawrence like a little bit of a mini like break for me, because Purdy and those rookies and stuff are off the board. And then we get into the pocket. You're right. You mentioned Aaron Rodgers, Cousins, Tua, those guys, Stafford. And so once I reach that point, I will be in the, if I don't have a guy by Trevor Lawrence, you really got to start thinking about what you're, like you said, it's going to be Derek Carr time and Bo Nix time. And that's okay. But I'm taking a ton of those elite guys, but I'm also constantly doing what you're doing. When I'm on the board, when I'm on the clock, I don't have a quarterback yet, and I'm deciding between 2 wide receivers or 2 tight ends, taking the one that it has a quarterback that's still available to me later, exactly like you did. So take Deontay Johnson instead of Xavier Worthy at that price, because Patrick Mahomes is gone. It still gives you those outs. And thinking about, we like to call it back to front drafting, like thinking about what's available to me later in the draft helps me with my earlier decisions and helps you feel less of that pain when you took Tyreek and Waddle and some, a-hole took to a round ahead of ADP. You feel okay because you took Deontay Johnson or you took, Cortland Sutton or something like that to set these backdoor stacks up.
Yeah, that's been one of the most glaring things for me drafting this summer, is that it's thinking in that way, right? Like an example of this too sort of goes into, so like I love Jacksonville, like the Trevor Lawrence example that you shared. He's one of my highest roster quarterbacks. And I think that's one of the reasons why, is because I feel most comfortable, and he's at the bottom of that tier, right? So he'd be the last one that you would be taking, and I feel most comfortable about him as like okay, this could be pretty legit this year. And so I have a lot of Jacksonville. They're easy to stack too. You know, it's like if you're in that front half of the draft, like, you know that you can get a lot of Jags and feel good about it and get
bunch of options too, right?
Yeah,
between all the different wide receivers, Evan Ingram, it's really flexible. It's scaring me because it's coming together way too nicely with the Jag stacks. There's no way that Trevor Lawrence gets better. He got paid and they're giving us all these guys for free. There's no way that it goes.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that I've noticed, and maybe this is something that you don't feel is true, but like, for instance, I was doing a live stream about a week or two ago, and I drafted Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and Brian Thomas, right? So it was a heavy Jag stack, and I reached for Trevor Lawrence instead of not reaching for him, because to me, when you're invested that heavily early on in a team like that, it doesn't give you the flexibility if you end up missing on that quarterback, right? And so when I got into round 10, I took Trevor Lawrence like over a round ahead of ADP because I knew how screwed I would be if I didn't get Trevor Lawrence in that scenario. It's similar to if you get, let's say you're in at the 5-6 turn or something like that, or in the 5th round into the 6th round, and you get like Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice or Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, and you don't have Patrick Mahomes. I do think it's really important, to your point, to keep in mind that you're not going to have as much flexibility later in your draft to find a proper stack. Is that the right way to be thinking about this stuff?
Absolutely. What I would say is the most difficult part about this is you have kind of two conflicting things. On one hand, you take your Jags example. You have all the Jags, right? Yeah. So no one else is incentivized to draft.
Hypothetically incentivized.
Right. Maybe with, it's a late night draft and they got a couple cocktails in them. They're feeling pretty incentivized to take your Trevor Lawrence, but they're theoretically not incentivized because it doesn't help their team. They don't have any Jaguars, so this doesn't make sense. So sometimes you actually can use that to your advantage, but it's kind of that awkward thing of trying to read your room on the fly, which is not that easy to do if you're in a fast draft. So it's that balancing act. Like it's more helpful when you're somewhere positioned around the turn, because it makes that decision a whole lot easier. When you're smack dab in the middle of the round and you got to decide, do I take him here or do I, and risk, or do I take him here or do I wait because these other guys, maybe they don't even need quarterbacks, but you run into that risk of potentially, throwing that $25 in the trash because somebody else did something that they shouldn't have done. I do tend to still be a little. Maybe I just am trying to feel something while drafting 1,000 best ball teams, but I like to push it more often, I think, than other people do. I think like you'll find you're already doing this, right? That building in as much flexibility as you can. It's like, this is not how I wanted this team to go. I took 3 Jaguars. I wanted Trevor Lawrence, but I still am able to be light on my feet, if you will, during the draft and figure something out with I've had the old Hunter Henry, Jacoby Brissett, even somebody took Drake May from you and you're like, we got to move on to the next. It's a delicate balance. I think so long as there's no one like between your selection and that guy's, ADP or your next pick, that like, you're not like, that's my flag plant player that's in between here. Right. There's not some, I don't have a running back yet or something. And I like really need Chase Brown or something. It's balancing all of that kind of stuff. I think it's totally fine to reach, but it's also kind of totally fine to try and push it. And so you kind of got to figure that out in draft for each person, what they're most comfortable doing.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. How much does strength of schedule? I haven't asked this actually to any of the bros that have come on the show to talk about this, but how much does strength of schedule play into your decision making? Like, do you? And this is mostly, I think, more towards the playoffs in week 15 to 17 and the way that people think about that. But like the Dolphins, for instance, like them playing in cold weather or them playing Cleveland in week 17. But then obviously we have the example of last year where one of the best games was the Jets against Cleveland, during the fantasy playoffs. So my question, though, is just straight up, how much do you factor in something like strength of schedule?
Well, it's funny. Last year, it was around this time, I think, my wife and I went to a happy hour at a local little restaurant pub, and they had on the previous year's Jets-Browns game on the TV at like 4:00 in July in St. Louis. I don't know why this game was on, but I was like, okay, I have a premonition now that this is going to be the game that you need. I didn't know that it was going to be Joe Flacco against Zach Wilson, but it's just funny because I'll always think about that because it was laughable, like at the time, to think that even with Aaron Rodgers, that game with those two defenses outdoors, on Christmas, that it could possibly, break the slate in week 17. But that's kind of the point. We see this every single year. We're just not that good at predicting who the toughest defenses are going to be. Like week 1, it's certainly not that good at predicting them at, almost in 2025. Like these games are around Christmas and New Year's. We're just not that good at predicting it. And even when we are, the Jets were an awesome defense last year. The Browns were an awesome defense last year. Fantasy points can still just come in these matchups. A couple of years ago, Panthers, Bucks. This is when the Bucks were not very good with Tom Brady. They were a 500 team. That was the game you needed. Mike Evans went crazy and DJ Moore went crazy and Tom Brady. And so those were actually decent defenses and not very good offenses. And so I really don't worry about it, the strength of schedule stuff. I do worry about the correlations. And then I just kind of let the variance play out. And some of them we're going to look back and say, well, yeah, we knew that game wasn't going to shoot out. And some of them you'll get Jets Browns from this year. And so I just try to focus in on the things that I can control. And that's only who's playing each other. It's not the weather and it's not the quality of the defense.
Yeah, that's good to hear because I think that people want fewer things to worry about while they're drafting, and that would be, one of those things. Let's talk about correlation a little bit since you brought it up. Have you been mostly focused on week 17 and those game stacks because obviously that's the week where it's championship week and that's where you can win a lot of money, or are you shifting whether it's because of the flat payout structure or just because you think it's smarter because you want to advance to even get to week 17 in the first place? Have you shifted your focus at all to look at more week 15 and week 16 game stacking? Or is it a scenario where you are just focused on week 17 and you just notice that naturally the week 15 and week 16 game stacks just kind of happen within your lineup?
It's definitely a lot of the last part. I think I understand why someone might say with the flatter structure and just get me to week 17. I'm going to focus more on weeks 15 and 16. I'm still I'm trying to win the whole thing. And so I'm optimizing for, that big week. It's also the week where you get paid off for that correlation being right. And I don't just mean because the payouts happen in that week. It's the week where you're competing against 500 other people. And even, it's not easy to get through week 15 and week 16. If it were, we probably wouldn't have the show. We'd just print all the money with all of our teams. But you really only got to beat, depending upon the tournament, Best Ball Mania, right? 15, 16 people in those weeks. That's tough, but it's not crazy. And so you're less incentivized to, really shoot for that. And that's what the correlation stuff is. It's shooting for this crazy outlier outcome that happens where because chaos is happening in this game, because there's big plays happening in this game, or because, the weather, whatever, something happens. CeeDee Lamb, catches a 90-yard touchdown because the blitzing backer doesn't tackle Dak Prescott, whatever. Speed up the game, Tyreek Hill, long touchdown, then Lamar Jackson, long touchdown. And the next thing you know, you're getting way more fantasy points from this game. That's great in week 15 and week 16, but it's you probably still didn't even need it in those weeks. You better have it in week 17. Jamar Chase goes for 50, Mike Evans goes for 50. And, on the other side, DJ Moore now is going to, they projected to throw 25 times. Now they're throwing 45 times. Those are the outcomes that you want and need in a bigger final like week 17. And so I'm really just focusing on it there, but you do get some of the, week 15 and 16 stuff naturally. And we built what Spike Week called our draft hacker that it'll overlay the playoff schedules on there for you, and it'll highlight the correlations that exist in those weeks. So you can see it, you get on the clock. We talked about tiebreakers to flexibility. You can also tie break to, well, this guy does play against my, quarterback in week 16, and you can still use it as a tiebreaker or, down the totem pole, but it's just not my priority when week 17 is so important.
Yeah, I think that's key, the tiebreaker thing. I've been doing that a lot. If anyone watches my live streams and stuff, I have a sheet sitting here. I'm just looking at matchups and stuff. And when there's when you start to build out your stacks, your team stacks, you start to know like which teams you're focused on most, right? Like if you're getting a Kansas City stack, then you got to focus on Kansas City and what their schedule looks like. Well, then all of a sudden you can start to like, okay, they're getting Pittsburgh in week 17, and then you can very quickly look at some shared opponents, right? Like you can just see if there are any, right? And start to build out that way. And again, I've been using it mostly as a tiebreaker. It's a little bit more difficult to, build out like full blown team stacks for like week 16. It's kind of hard because I do think too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but ADP seems to formulate at least a little bit to what game stacks are and what these week 7, like you're going to see pretty consistent players going in pretty consistent spots, not just because of their talent level, but because of how they work within team stacks and then how they work within game stacks too.
100%. And I think the best example of this this playing out is actually sort of in the inverse, but you see quarterbacks, certain particular quarterbacks who are so tied to their pass catchers have crazy wide range of outcomes on their ADP. Because you'll get the situation where I took Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Devon Achane. I need Tua on this team. So the guy reaches, 2 rounds to take Tua because they got to have him. But then you'll also get Dak Prescott when I don't have CeeDee Lamb and maybe I don't have Jake Ferguson. I'm like, why the heck would I ever take that?
Exactly.
Sorry, Brandon Cooks and Jalen Tolbert. Like this doesn't sound like how do I win $1.5 million showing up to this gunfight with a water gun of Jalen Tolbert against the CeeDee Lamb teams? Like, you see this, but that's exactly the point. The things start to align not only by ADP, but also in that given draft, right? Again, to the, people being incentivized or not incentivized, you'll get the people who will just take the falling Dak Prescott, or like I said, for whatever reason, take Tua ahead of ADP when they don't have any of those guys. But generally speaking, the market kind of aligns to the correlation principles. It's much less so on the, like bring back to week 17 stuff, but there's still a little, there's still a little bit of it. You'll see a handful of them. I think the market generally like kind of cherry picks their favorite week 17 correlations. And that's when you start to see it align. I'll never forget. It was either 2 or 3 years ago. The LA teams played each other, the Chargers and the Rams in week 17. It was a disastrous season for both teams. Like by week 17, it was Baker Mayfield and Cam Akers against, whoever for the Chargers, but ADP would totally Cooper Kupp, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Austin Eckler. These guys would align at the turns. And so you'll get some specific situations like that where not only the teams start to align by ADP, but maybe the opponent in week 17 does. And so just being cognizant of everything that you just said, but the correlation definitely drives a decent chunk of the market.
Yeah, I miss the days, in early May, when you could get Puka Nacua, then Marvin Harrison Jr., and then Cooper Kupp in the third. When Kupp was going in the late third, those were the chef kiss days. But now Cooper Kupp more so going at the 2-3 turn. One topic that I haven't discussed that much about and with guests throughout this podcast series, I did a little bit last week with Mark. He kind of brought it up more organically, but it's exposure and how we should be managing exposure. I think it might be my downfall this year. We'll see, but I'm flatter than I think a lot of people are. I then see someone like Davis Maddock, friend of the show, who likes to take stands and will have 35 to 40% exposed players, which I don't know if it's that my brain doesn't work that way and I just can't get over the hump, and if that is or isn't optimal. But like, for instance, right now, my highest exposed player is like Zach Charbonnet, and he's like at 22%. Like it's not very high. And then a lot of my quarterbacks are pretty flat. And then, like I have a lot of guys above 15%, or 16%, like I'm doubling up where the market is at, but it's hard for me to really get it like to 25 to 30%. Do you think that's a mistake? And how do you sort of handle your exposure?
So I wouldn't call it a mistake. I would say we talk about when you build an entire company around best ball, naturally exposures is probably going to be a conversation that everybody wants to talk about, and you build tools around it. So what I try to always tell everybody is the individual player exposure is like almost entirely risk tolerance, and like also what you think that your skill set is. Like, is your edge? There are some people who, come in and they're straight game theory bros, right? I don't know it. I don't even know who these players are. I go to brunch on Sundays. I don't watch football. So your skills are going to be different than maybe you and I's skills in this game. And then even if you believe that there are player take edges, you can say, like, I don't want my whole season to go down the drain because I have 50% of this guy. And I can tell you, when you draft like 45% J.K. Dobbins and he tears his Achilles in the first half of week 1, it's not an awesome feeling. So, that clearly was me last year. But what I do think is, where I focus the most and how I handle it for me personally is I do think just about everybody who's playing has some form of like, there's something that you think is an edge in the player pool. Like, even these people who like say that they don't have player takes, there's something that you're like, this is mispriced, or just like, maybe it's not mispriced, but the upside far outweighs, maybe I think that Dave Canales is going to bring the Panthers back to, back to being a good offense. And the market has said that is clearly not going to happen at these prices. You think that that's a potential edge. I like to kind of call those like core assets. I try to define a few things that I feel passionately myself are mispriced. These are the edges. And it could be individual players, but it also could be like an offense. Last year it was the Ravens was one of them for me. J.K. Dobbins and Mark Andrews didn't go super well, but the rest of it was fine.
Yeah, the idea was actually right for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Sam Howell actually last year, which went great until the final month when he decided to get benched every other game. But I honed in on a couple things. Those are my core pieces. This is probably going to define my season, and then I'm trying to diversify around that. So my actual portfolio is not that diverse. But it is there's no reason for me not to have Jaguar stacks with Sam Howell if I'm drafting a ton of Sam Howell, right? So then going into my portfolio and like massaging all of that stuff is really what I spend most of my summer doing. I'm in a draft and like Tyler Algier is my highest owned running back. And so like when I get to I'm going to take Tyler Algier again, but let's look at what my exposure is with Tyler Algier and the other players that are on my roster. And that kind of combinatorial element is really what I do a ton of. So defining that, like I said, most people probably have it, but if you do, defining it and understanding, like, I'm taking this bet on the Falcons or I'm taking this bet on the Ravens, and that's my stand. Now let's make sure that I'm not, bringing in a second bet that was totally unintended. I'm drafting the Ravens and all of my Ravens have Cowboys, and there's no reason for that to be the case. So that's really what I spend my summer doing.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good point. And one that I haven't focused enough on, like I think about it, but haven't focused enough on, is looking at, if you're drafting a guy a lot, to see what those pieces around him look like, so that you're switching. And it's similar to like DFS building, right? Like where you have your core and then you're kind of switching. And I haven't been much of a DFS player over the last handful of years, but where you have your core and you're sort of just changing and manipulating things outside of that core so that you get the right combinations and stuff. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about tight end. Tight end to me could be a make or break position this year. Because it feels like you're, because we have the elite tight ends that are going for cheaper prices this year. You have some intriguing enough middle round-ish, middle range or low end tight end ones, let's say. I just think the difference this year is that people are struggling with late round tight ends and not necessarily knowing which direction to go in. Are there any late round tight ends that you're focused on, or are you attacking the Trey McBrides, the Mark Andrews, the Travis Kelce's a lot more? But really, I mean, are there any late round tight ends that you feel great about, or is that a place where you're just getting sprinkles of exposure to and not really having like massive exposure to one guy?
I'm definitely on the sicko side of finding some of these disgusting late tight ends that I can like, for whatever reason, really start to believe in. It was partially because I was so into the Commanders last year, but I talked myself very heavily into Logan Thomas and Cole Turner even for a while. Famously, I was the only person drafting Cole Turner in Best Ball Mania last year. He was on my I made the finals last year, and Cole Turner was my tight end too on the team. So I don't know how that happened, but I do think on one hand, I much prefer the elite tight ends this year. I think that the market is definitely very different. Last year, the rookie tight end class, as you know, was just so superior to this year's rookie tight end class, which obviously gave us a couple of additional options. Particularly Sam Laporta was the one who really, really hit. Trey McBride in his second year, as a former Mackey winner, like second round pick, getting the veteran out of the way with not that much target competition. Jake Ferguson, in a Dallas Cowboys offense with no real competition at the tight end spot. There were just so many more like legit high upside options. This year, it's like, is Noah Fant going to break out in year 6 or 7 or whatever it is? Right. Is Jonnu gonna become something with the Dolphins? It's a much different market, I think. I struggle with this one because I'm really big on like trying not to be overconfident in some of these types of really high variance situations. And what history would tell us is no matter what we think about the late tight ends, someone's probably going to pop up.
Hit. Yep.
Yeah. Like nobody saw Jordan Reed coming. Speaking of the Commanders back in the day, like we just don't see it coming as much as we think that we do. So I'm trying to lean into that a little bit, while still like being really heavy on the elite tight end side, because I think that you mentioned they're cheaper this year. And part of the reason why the late tight end could be so successful is, Travis Kelce used to be a first round pick in these best ball drafts. Now the tight end one goes at the 3-4 turn, and George Kittle goes in the 70s, and, Brock Bowers goes past pick 100. There's so many more elite options at cheaper prices. I do prefer that, but I'm digging into, Jonnu is one of my favorite guys back there. Just the Dolphin. I mean, I think Jonnu's pretty good, and he fits the offense. Certainly a little better than Durham Smythe. I think just a slightly better fit in the offense. I'm taking some Chig Okonkwo, mostly on like Levis, Titans, and Jags stuff. But I think a potentially good player in this new offense is exciting at a cheap price. And then my mega deep flyer is Eric All.
Nice.
I promise. It's not just because of his name, because he spells it wrong. He spells it silly.
He does.
But I people are going to say, "Aren't you worried he got hurt last year?" Yeah. I'm extremely worried that he's not going to be healthy. But I think he was a really exciting prospect.
He was.
From a like yards per route run perspective, which is a lot of the base level stats I use to just like quickly define a player. Like he was as good as like he was right next to Brock Bowers. I know it's a small sample last year, but his offense was terrible too. So it's kind of impressive to be that good even on a small sample in that offense. And I just think he's a good player in a Bengals situation that we've been craving a tight end. We Irv Smith and now Mike Gesicki and all. We keep drafting these guys, and we know that there's something else available to us in the Bengals offense. Tyler Boyd has done it. Tanner Hudson did it for a stretch. Guys produce in this offense if he's good, and they seem to think that he's pretty good. There's rumors that they were considering taking him as high as pick 80 overall. I think he's a really fun bet, and he's not even drafted in every single draft. So as a last round pick, you don't need, we can wait for the knee to get better, and hopefully he can pop over the second half of the season.
Yeah, that's a really good deep sleeper. And it's a nice pivot off of Gesicki. Like I've taken plenty of Gesicki too, but I do think that that's a good, like, just nice game theory pivot, and exposure pivot versus what the field is doing, because I can't even, I try to pay attention to what other teams are doing in the 18th round. By the time you're in the 18th, you're like, whatever, I'm just getting my guy. I don't really care who people are drafting. Yep. But I don't remember many people getting Eric All. So you're going to get a pretty good number on him versus the rest of the competition. And then, as we know, rookies do a lot better during the second half of the season, towards the end of the season. And then there's the injury upside. It makes a lot of sense. I like that call out a lot. Is there a team, you mentioned Baltimore last year as a team that you were attacking, and Washington a little bit with Sam Howell. Is there a team this year that you think is just undervalued?
The Jags that we talked about before, I definitely believe that one. Ironically, I do think Washington, again, is pretty undervalued. Maybe I'm just a sucker for this team, but they keep plopping these high upside running quarterbacks in there. A Heisman Trophy winner, top 5 pick in Jaden Daniels, with, say whatever we want about Cliff Kingsbury, and we can probably say a lot about Cliff Kingsbury. I do trust there to be fantasy points in the offense.
Agreed.
And they're going to sling it around. The running game's probably going to be fairly efficient. I like Brian Robinson as a player. His price is really nice. Austin Eckler's not my style of pick. I'm a little bit of an ageist, but
same.
he's still Austin Eckler, and there's it's possible he was just hurt last year. And then the most expensive player is Terry McLaurin, and then there's like nobody on the offense that gets drafted. Luke McCaffrey has like some of the cleanest runway I've ever seen for a rookie wide receiver, and the market's just like not interested. I guess can't really figure out why. So those two would probably be my favorites, and then mixing and matching a lot of cheap ones. So just, you mentioned like the Broncos and the Titans. I do take more Titans to set up Levitt. Like, I don't really like Calvin Ridley, and Hopkins fine, but I'll take those guys to set up Will Levis later. So I'm becoming a little overweight on the Titans as well.
Yeah, the Titans are my team this year, apparently, just based on my exposure. I can't tell though if it's like I like the Titans or I just like the Jags, and it's like this combo of like, again, getting Will Levis late just because I get a Hopkins or something like that, or if it's like the combination of that and me drafting so many Jags and just having that week 17 correlation. So I'm glad to see that you're mostly on the same page there. One last question before I let you go. You're in the 18th round. Obviously correlation and team stacking is going to play a role in who you pick, but who are some of your favorite 18th round picks over on Underdog this year?
Ooh, this is a good one. And so what I will say, just quickly to your first point, correlation is definitely part of it. I'm correlating a little less with those last picks maybe than I have historically, because not that it's wrong. It's definitely not wrong to correlate those guys, but I found it to be a little bit of a slippery slope in terms of the players I would forgive myself for taking in the last round, because I could explain it away through correlation. The amount of Braxton Berrios teams I had to look at during the middle of last year, all because that was, I'm taking a ton of Ravens. I was taking a lot of Dolphins, and you're like, I need a last wide receiver.
Yeah.
He's like I said, these guys, when I'm drafting with our tools, it's like popping off the screen, right? He's highlighting in yellow. It's like, take me. And I'm like, I don't want to be taking the Braxton Berrioses and making myself feel better because they correlate. Like, every time you take that, you don't get Puka Nacua. You don't get Tank Dell. And so I am being a little choosier with those guys. I mentioned Eric All, another Bengal. This is another one of my like pet guys, but Andre Yoshivas, or Yoshi, second year player out of the old Ivy League, a fun, weird profile that he has. But I kind of think he's talented. He's getting a little bit of buzz already, and the market has said Jermaine Burton is for sure the wide receiver 3 in Cincinnati. And this isn't a situation where the incumbent, and there isn't really an incumbent, but it's not Van Jefferson, where you could say like, okay, if Puka's any good, he's going to take Van Jefferson's job. It's more like, do we really know that Jermaine Burton is better than Yoshivas? Because it's a second year player versus a rookie. I would bet Burton being the guy, but I'm willing to bet on an undrafted 18th rounder, Yoshi, ends up just being better than that guy. And another wide receiver that I really like on a team that I probably should have mentioned, I like the Packers a ton. I think they're really cheap, and I like all the wide receivers. They have an 18th round wide receiver who really took on a big role down the stretch, and I think is a pretty good, fun young player in Bo Melton, who, again, undrafted in these drafts and was playing a ton of snaps, like put up a monster week in the first round of the playoffs or last week of the regular season, something like that. And is already, again, like they're telling us, like, he's going to play, man. He's going to be on the field. So that's a nice little stable floor on a fun offense. And if Christian Watson's hamstrings don't work again, then, maybe you get even more routes. Just a couple of running back flyers. Evan Hull's one of my guys. I know Trey Sermon is the RB2 there behind Jonathan Taylor, but I think it's like one of those faux RB2s where if JT goes down, Trey Sermon's definitely going to play, but it's going to be like the low value touch. You get the carries between the 20s. You're not going to play on passing downs. And I like to bet on the more diverse skill set and probably more talented player in the Evan Hulls of the world. And then Rasheen Ali is my other guy. Just again, kind of Justice Hill is like very Trey Sermon in terms of a backup running back. Like, he's going to be there, he's fine, but he's never going to be like a superstar. If Ali is just good and something were to happen to Derrick Henry, I think that there's a ton of upside.
Yeah, Ali, that's the exact logic that I use for Ali being a great late round dart throwing rookie drafts this year, is that Like his profile actually wasn't that bad in my model.
No.
Like he didn't look bad at all. Had really strong production. I think he's a do-it-all back too. But like, look at the competition, man. I mean, you're talking about a 30-year-old Derrick Henry who might not be the like. I'm not saying don't draft him. I'm just saying there's the chance that he's not the same guy. There's at least that chance, and he also might get hurt. And then Justice Hill, and then obviously Keaton Mitchell's starting the season injured. So there is an opportunity for him to at least step out, and if he shows up and shows out, then we could see some fantasy production from him in a good offense. Eric, that was awesome, man. It was great to finally chat with you. This is the first show that we were ever able to do together. It was a lot of fun. Let everyone know where they can find you and what you guys are doing over at Spike Week.
Yeah, on Twitter at Eric Beimfohr, and of course everything over at Spike Week. JJ and I were talking briefly before the show. We built some of the like first of its kind best ball tools. Two in particular, I just wanted to point out that I drive a lot of the stuff we talked about here today that helped me implement a lot of this stuff is what we call our draft hacker, which overlays customizable information. You can see during your draft whatever you want to see on your screen, the week 17 stuff, playoff schedules, your exposures, all the combinatorial exposure stuff I was talking about. I manage it because we built a tool to help me manage it while I'm drafting. I can see all of that stuff. And then after the fact, kind of a portfolio analyzer tool in what we call Draft IQ, where you can go in and see, anything that you want to see about all of your teams that you've drafted. We focus really, really heavily on making tools that help people kind of implement what their strategy is and their opinions. And, you don't have to like the same players that I like, but we're going to help you draft more effectively given the things that you think are edges in these drafts. And so check that all out at spikeweek.com.
Awesome stuff. And make sure you guys are checking out the late round draft guide over on lateround.com. You can take advantage of the Underdog promo. Just use promo code late round when you sign up at Underdog, make a deposit, and you'll get that draft guide. It's a $25 guide. You'll get it for absolutely free in your email inbox. Check it all out, lateround.com. Otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.